As Allison reminded us in the midst of her prayer, tomorrow is Veterans Day, a day in which we honor and remember those that have served. And I would ask simply, if you have served in the military of any form, will you simply stand right where you are and allow us to thank you for your service to us today? Thank you. So the lectionary is a church word that is essentially a book of Bible readings that are read on certain days of the year, and it follows the liturgical year, the church calendar, if you will. And these lectionaries have been around for thousands of years. They date all the way back to the Torah and God's command to remember certain times in history. And the Revised Common Lectionary is a 3-year cycle designed for Protestant churches here in the United States and in Canada. And the thought is that if you were to read each of those scriptures on each Sunday over the course of 3 years, there's an Old Testament, a Hebrew Bible, there's something from the Psalms, something from the Gospels, and something from the Epistles. And if you were to read each of those every Sunday over the course of 3 years, that you would have a really good understanding of the arc and the narrative of Scripture. Now, there are some churches, some denominations that follow the lectionary faithfully, who never deviate. But as you know, my style is I tend to preach series. But oftentimes, in between series, like we are now, I revert back to the lectionary. And the lectionary text for today is from Mark's Gospel. And where we pick up the story, Jesus is in the temple where he's being questioned, where he's being tested by the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, the Pharisees were the largest and most influential religious and political party of the New Testament time. And they were repeatedly depicted in the Gospels as being antagonists, opponents of Jesus and those early Christians. Well, here in this story, where we pick it up, they have been testing him. They have been peppering him with questions, trying to trip him up. But he stands tall and he stands strong until finally they give up. But it's in this moment, as you'll hear, that Jesus turns the table and puts them in the hot seat. So I invite you to hear this word now from Mark's Gospel.
From the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples, and he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put everything she had, all she had to live on." Here ends the reading, the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So, church, I have to confess to you that I've been a little busy this week. Did I miss anything? Anything noteworthy or newsworthy happened this week that I might not be aware of? You know, in the weeks leading up to the election, we engaged in a series that was part of a wider campaign, a wider initiative that was focused on undoing polarization, on actively modeling kindness, trying to find ways to build inclusive community. We called it simply loving your neighbor, and reminded ourselves that in the midst of this election, before we are Democrats, before we are Republicans, we are followers of Jesus. And the way of Jesus is to love our neighbor. It was an invitation to consider how it is that we want to be treated. And in response, how we treat others, including those with whom we disagree. It was an invitation to treat one another with kindness and with respect, with compassion, and with love. And I would argue that now, on this side of the election, that's even more important than it was before. On Tuesday, I woke up and I was looking through the news the day of the election, and I saw in a poll on CNN that 1 in 7 were anxious about the election. And my immediate thought was, that's it? 1 in 7? What are these other 3 doing? Are they living under a rock? There was part of me that wished that I was one of those 3. Because now, in the last several days, I have heard from many people in my care as your pastor. And many of you have reached out to me and expressed dismay and fear and anger, and some, to be honest with you, even worse. Some of you today are heartbroken and terrified. Now, I also have friends in the congregation, people that I know and love, who are relieved, who are excited, who are even celebrating, who finally believe that our country's back on the right path, that God has answered their prayers. Some of you are rejoicing and hopeful. And as I said, loving our neighbor is more important now than ever before, but also more difficult. The Apostle Paul tells us that one of the marks of a true Christian is to let love be genuine. And he goes on and he says that we are to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep. And there's a lot of that this week. A lot of rejoicing and a lot of weeping. And so needless to say, I've been a little nervous, a little anxious about this morning, about really knowing what to say in a moment like this. Because I know that most of you, maybe even all of you, you come here each week as people would come to any service of worship and to hear a word of hope, to hear some uplifting thought, some noble sentiment which you can carry with you throughout the week. And you are right to expect that, especially from the sermon, because what is religion if not to set our hearts and our minds on higher things? Now, when I was in seminary years ago, back when Moses was still in short pants, when I was in seminary, I was taught that the role of the preacher, as Karl Barth once said, is to stand with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in other, and to find a way to speak to the moment through the lens of Scripture. And that we are to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. In my experience, that sentiment, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, is a sentiment that's often used by clergy, but not always practiced. To be honest with you, the comforting the afflicted, that part's easy. It comes natural to me. It's my honest inclination. It's the afflicting the comfortable that sometimes is a little bit more difficult. I'll be honest with you, that part is hard for me because, as my therapist will tell you, I'm a bit of a people pleaser. I like people to like me. In fact, I want people to love me, and I know that I talk a good game. My clergy staff will tell you that, he talks a good game. He's got thick skin. He doesn't care what other people think. But the truth is, I do. I do care. I like to be liked. I want people to love me. But I would argue that it's more than that. Reinhold Niebuhr was one of the most renowned theologians of the 20th century. He was an ethicist and a commentator on politics and public affair, and he went on to be a professor at Union Seminary in New York for over 20 years. Brilliant, brilliant mind. And when he was just graduating seminary, when he was getting ready to go out to serve the church, he always thought that preachers said so little in sermons because they were cowards, because they were afraid of losing their jobs. And then, a few months into his first church, Niebuhr discovered why pastors are reluctant to say too much, to be too critical, to push too far. And that is quite simply that we grow to love the people we serve. We love the people we serve. We love you. We love the people sitting in our pews. We love the church. And I say all of that as a way to acknowledge that I'm very much aware that right now, in this polarized time, a time that is fraught with emotion, that I'm preaching to both sides. To all of you, some of you who are rejoicing and some who are weeping, some of you who are comfortable and some of you who are afflicted. Now, on Thursday, my initial thought, this was this brilliant idea that I had, was that not knowing a way to speak to everyone, I thought what I will do is I'll preach 2 sermons today. I'll preach 2 sermons, one to those that are comfortable, those that are afflicted, and it'll be great. It'll be so much easier. It'll be so much easier to speak to each faction where you are in this moment. And part of the reason that I love this idea is because I knew that it would unite us as one, because no one wants to hear 2 sermons. Am I right? That was Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, I've come to the realization that the sermon that I give this morning is much less important than the sermon that you will give. That the sermon that I give this morning is much less important than the sermon that you are giving. Cheryl Strayed is an author, and she wrote this week calling all people who claim to follow Jesus like we all do to take an inventory of ourselves, to look at how we are handling the results of this election. She said simply, the world is watching you, how you handle loss, how you handle a win, and both, she says, say a lot about Jesus. So what sermon are you giving, she says? Now, she went on to say that this doesn't deny that whatever emotions you're feeling regarding the results of this election, that you are allowed to be either extremely hopeful or feel discouraged. But either way, she says, we are all Americans. That we're all in the same boat, we're all driving in the same direction. And therefore, she says, to wish harm or dissension or pain or lack of progress towards those who we believe differently is actually self-harm. That we must find a way to operate, to work through conflict, to pursue unity, to establish healthy soil for all of us to thrive. That this is the process wherever you are in this. That you are a part of this, that there is work to be done, and we all get to put our hands in the soil together. What a blessing, she says. If you are anxious and worried, that despair that you feel must not steal your witness to the hope that is Jesus Christ. And if you are rejoicing this morning, that joy must not steal your witness to Jesus' compassion for your neighbor. Grieve or celebrate as you must. But our work together continues. Our work together remains the same, that just like before, we will need to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God, and that is more important now than ever before. That lectionary text that we read just a minute ago, we heard the story of the widow's mite, and in that story, the story is often brought out and preached during the stewardship season. It's a story of this woman's generosity, of sacrificial giving. And the reason that I know that that's oftentimes the sermon that is preached on this text is because I've preached that sermon before. But this morning I want to look at it slightly differently. from a different angle. Now, Mark points out that this woman was a widow, and a poor widow at that. Now, widows are discussed over 80 times in the Bible, and they are lifted up over and over again simply because they are the most vulnerable members of society. Remember, this is the day before State Farm or Mutual of Omaha, before there were insurance payouts to cover the bills in the event of your husband's death. And so any inheritance that might come to a surviving spouse today would have gone to the son back then. And then the widow would be expected to go and to live with the oldest son and his family and have them provide for her until she died. But what if she had no sons? Or what if her son was too young to make an own living? And in that moment, she was just simply at the mercy of society. While already sad, the death of one's husband, it created a real threat, a real vulnerability for a widow. And that's exactly why the Bible talks so much about them. Now, some scholars say that by lifting up the widow's actions, that Jesus is just heaping praise on her generosity. But I also think that part of what he's doing in that moment is indicting the system that keeps her poor in the first place. He's calling us not just to be generous, but more importantly, he's asking us to ask ourselves tough questions. Questions like, how did she get to this place where all she has is 2 copper coins left? How can we allow that to happen in a society where the marginalized, the most vulnerable, found themselves with nothing to give, nothing to eat? You see, over and over again, Jesus repeatedly lifts up the little, the lost, the least, the poor, the sick, the lame, and calls us as his followers, as his disciples, to care for them, while at the same time saving his harshest criticism for the rich, for the powerful, for the privileged, for the people wearing long robes, sitting in places of prominence, praying large prayers. You see, what I'm coming to see is that if we are going to follow Jesus, we must stand on the side of the most vulnerable in our society. That when power and privilege become the starting points, those on the margins are always the one who suffer the most. I don't know if you're aware, but there is this large push right now by evangelicals to post the 10 Commandments in public places. Classrooms, in fact, of our public schools. But what always baffles me every time this movement comes is that these Christians are so eager to post the commandments, but never once do they suggest that we post the sayings of Jesus. The 10 Commandments must be posted, but the words of Jesus, things like when he said, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful," well, that doesn't fit our agenda. When he says, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself," that no other commandment is greater than that one. Look, I know that we are deeply divided over this election, and some are weeping and some are rejoicing. But I would remind us that our unity is not based on our agreement for one another, but in our mutual concern for one another. In our mutual concern for the world, especially the most vulnerable in our society. And so our common goal must now be to be faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to lift up the most vulnerable, the little, the lost, and the least. Because over and over, Jesus points to the greatness of the small. He talks about widows. He talks about babies like we did this morning. He talks about the importance, the greatness of the small. So this morning, I wish that I could find the right words to tell you how significant it is. How great it is when you are able to do something like simply smile at a cashier who seems stressed and overburdened. to take a meal to the home of someone who was sick, to provide a ride to church for someone who otherwise couldn't be here, to take an afternoon to listen to the struggles and the troubles of a teenager. It's those little things that become huge in the eyes of God. Saint Teresa of Calcutta once said, "There are no great things, only small things done with great love." My wife, Kelly, took our daughter, Caroline, this last week to see Taylor Swift. It was a big weekend in the Peterman and Rose household, I can tell you that. And they came back beaming, and it was like nothing they'd ever seen, they said, with tears in their eyes. There was so much love in that room. There were 60,000 people singing every word to every song. And I have to believe, she says, that there were some on the left and some on the right, but in that moment we were focused on something better, something greater. And that was our unity. Knowing that I was struggling with what to say this week, Kelly sent me a quote. She's now a Swiftie. And she reminded me of something that Taylor once said, that we don't need to share the same opinions as others, but we need to be respectful. No matter what happens in life, be good to people. Being good to people is a wonderful legacy to leave behind. Church, that's the best sermon I got today. But the bigger question is, what sermon will you preach? What legacy will you leave behind?